There's something happening right now in your life that you might not fully understand. Maybe it's that conversation that went sideways for no reason. Maybe it's the person who used to be kind, but now seems to carry this heavy, dark energy wherever they go. Or maybe it's that family member who speaks words that cut deeper than they should. Words that seem designed to steal your peace and plant seeds of doubt in your mind. Here's what I want you to understand today. What you're experiencing isn't just bad attitudes or difficult personalities. You're witnessing something far more serious, something the Bible has been warning us about for thousands of years. We're living in a world where invisible forces are actively working through people to accomplish one primary goal: to disrupt God's plan in your life and steal the peace, joy, and purpose He has given you. Now, before you think this is going to be some wild, over-the-top spiritual warfare video, let me be clear about something. This isn't about fear. This isn't about seeing demons behind every disagreement or blaming spiritual forces for every conflict you face. What we're talking about today is discernment. It's about understanding the difference between ordinary human conflict and something deeper, something that requires a different kind of response. The truth is, if you've been walking with God for any length of time, you've already encountered this. You've felt that shift in the atmosphere when certain people walk into a room. You've experienced conversations that seem to drain your spiritual energy in ways you couldn't explain. You've watched people you care about say things that were so out of character, so opposed to everything they normally stand for, that you wondered if you were talking to the same person. What I'm about to share with you isn't theory. It's not religious speculation or spiritual fantasy. This is biblical truth that actually works when you apply it correctly. And here's the thing that most believers miss. You don't have to be a victim of these spiritual attacks. You don't have to live in constant frustration, wondering why the people around you seem to be working against your peace and God's purposes in your life. The Bible is crystal clear about this reality. From the very beginning, we see that there's a war happening. Not a war between people, but a war in the spiritual realm that manifests through people. And if you belong to Jesus Christ, you have been given authority in this battle. Real authority. Not the kind that comes from your personality, your education, or your social status. The kind that comes from heaven itself. But here's where most Christians get stuck. They know there's spiritual warfare happening, but they don't know how to engage it properly. They either ignore it completely and wonder why they keep getting spiritually beat up, or they go to the other extreme and start seeing everything as a demonic attack, which actually gives the enemy more attention and power than he deserves. What we're going to uncover today is the biblical approach, the approach that Jesus himself used when he encountered people under spiritual influence, the approach that the apostles used when they faced similar situations in their ministry. This isn't about screaming at people or performing dramatic exorcisms. This is about understanding your spiritual authority and learning how to use it with wisdom, love, and power. Let me paint a picture for you. Think about the last time you were in a situation where someone's words or actions left you feeling spiritually drained. Maybe it was a coworker who always seems to bring negativity into every conversation. Maybe it was a family member who constantly speaks doubt over your dreams and calling. Or maybe it was someone who used to encourage you, but now seems determined to tear down everything you're trying to build for God's kingdom. In that moment, what did you do? Did you argue back? Did you try to reason with them? Did you get frustrated and walk away feeling defeated? Or did you recognize that you might not be dealing with just a difficult person, but with a spiritual influence working through that person to accomplish something specific against you? Here's what most believers don't realize. The enemy doesn't usually come at you directly. He's too smart for that. He knows that if he showed up obviously, you'd recognize him and fight back spiritually. Instead, he works through the people closest to you. He uses their voices, their relationships with you, their knowledge of your weaknesses to deliver his attacks in ways that seem natural and personal. This is why spiritual discernment is so crucial. You need to be able to distinguish between someone having a bad day and someone being used as a vessel for spiritual opposition. You need to understand the difference between constructive criticism and words that are designed to plant fear, doubt, and confusion in your heart. The good news is that God hasn't left you defenseless. He hasn't sent you into this battle without weapons or strategy. In fact, when you understand what the Bible teaches about spiritual authority, you'll realize that you have more power than you've ever imagined. Not power to control people or manipulate situations, but power to create an atmosphere where God's voice becomes louder than the enemy's lies. But before we dive into the practical strategies, I need you to understand something fundamental. This isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone around you. It's not about living in paranoia or treating every conflict as a spiritual battle. What we're talking about is developing the kind of spiritual maturity that can tell the difference between flesh and spirit, between human weakness and demonic influence. Jesus demonstrated this perfectly throughout his ministry. When Peter tried to discourage him from going to the cross, Jesus didn't say, "Peter, you're being negative." He recognized the spiritual source behind Peter's words and addressed it directly. When the Pharisees questioned his authority, he didn't get into theological debates. He spoke with divine authority that even the demons recognized and obeyed. This is the level of spiritual awareness we need to develop. Not to live in fear, but to live in power. Not to see enemies everywhere, but to recognize when the real enemy is trying to use people we care about to derail God's purposes in our lives. Over the next several parts of this series, we're going to break down exactly how to do this. We're going to look at the biblical principles that govern spiritual authority. We're going to examine the practical strategies that actually work when you're dealing with people under spiritual influence. And we're going to learn how to create an atmosphere in your life that makes it impossible for demonic voices to operate through the people around you. But it all starts with understanding that you're not fighting people. You're fighting for people. The goal isn't to defeat the person who's giving you trouble. The goal is to silence the spiritual influence that's using that person to create chaos in your life and theirs. This changes everything about how you respond to difficult people and situations. Instead of taking things personally, you start recognizing the real source of the conflict. Instead of arguing with people, you start addressing the spiritual forces behind their words and actions. Instead of feeling powerless and frustrated, you start moving in the authority that God has already given you. The techniques we're going to explore aren't complicated, but they are powerful. They're not based on human psychology or conflict resolution strategies. They're based on the same spiritual principles that Jesus used when he walked the earth, and they work just as effectively today when applied with faith and wisdom. The first thing you need to understand is that most believers have been approaching this completely backwards. They've been trying to change people instead of changing the spiritual climate around those people. They've been fighting symptoms instead of addressing the root cause. And that's exactly why they keep having the same battles over and over again with the same individuals. Let me show you what I mean. Think about the last time someone said something to you that immediately triggered anger, fear, or discouragement. Your natural response was probably to defend yourself, to correct them, or to argue your point. But what if I told you that in that moment, you weren't actually dealing with that person's opinion? What if you were dealing with a calculated spiritual attack, designed to get you to respond in your flesh instead of your spirit? This is where most Christians lose the battle before it even begins. The moment you start defending yourself with human reasoning, the moment you start arguing from an emotional place, you've stepped out of spiritual authority and into the enemy's playing field. And on his playing field, he always has the advantage. Here's what the enemy knows that most believers don't. He knows that your spiritual authority is only effective when you're operating from a place of alignment with God's Spirit. The second you get pulled into flesh-based responses, you lose access to the very power that could silence his influence immediately. This is why Jesus never argued with demons. He never tried to reason with them or explain why they were wrong. He simply spoke with authority, and they had no choice but to obey. But notice something crucial about every encounter Jesus had with demonic spirits. He never confused the person with the spirit influencing them. When the Gadarene demoniac ran toward Jesus, screaming and cutting himself with stones, Jesus didn't see a crazy man who needed to be avoided. He saw a human being who was being tormented by spiritual forces, and he addressed those forces directly while showing compassion to the person who was suffering under their influence. This distinction is absolutely critical if you want to operate in real spiritual authority. You cannot hate the person and effectively deal with the spirit at the same time. You cannot hold offense against someone and simultaneously move in the kind of love that actually breaks spiritual strongholds. But here's where it gets challenging for most of us. The people the enemy uses to attack us spiritually are often the people we care about most. It's your spouse who suddenly becomes critical and discouraging. It's your parent who starts speaking words of limitation over your calling. It's your closest friend who begins to question every decision you make and plant seeds of doubt about God's direction in your life. When the attack comes through someone you love, your first instinct is to take it personally. You think they've changed their opinion of you. You assume they no longer believe in you or support your vision. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if they're being influenced by forces they don't even recognize? Forces that are using their voice and their relationship with you to accomplish something they would never consciously agree to. This is where spiritual discernment becomes your greatest asset. You need to learn how to separate the person from the influence. You need to develop the ability to hear what's really being said beneath the surface of someone's words. Let me give you a practical example. Your spouse comes home from work and immediately starts criticizing everything about your day. They question your priorities, they make sarcastic comments about your faith, and they seem determined to drag you into an argument. Your flesh wants to defend itself. Your emotions want to fight back. But what if you paused for a moment and asked yourself a different question? What spirit is driving this conversation? Maybe your spouse had a difficult day at work and encountered people who were speaking discouragement over their life. Maybe they were exposed to conversations, media, or environments that were filled with negativity and doubt. And now they're home, and that same spirit that influenced them throughout the day is trying to use them to transfer that discouragement to you. The person you love is still in there. Their heart toward you hasn't changed. But they're carrying something they picked up in their environment, and that something wants to use their voice to steal your peace and plant confusion in your home. When you recognize this dynamic, everything changes about how you respond. Instead of getting defensive, you get strategic. Instead of arguing with your spouse, you start addressing the spiritual atmosphere that's influencing them. Instead of taking their words personally, you begin to intercede for them, knowing that they're under attack just as much as you are. This is what it means to fight for people instead of against them. This is how you begin to operate in the kind of spiritual authority that actually creates breakthrough instead of just more conflict. But let me be clear about something. Recognizing spiritual influence doesn't mean you become a doormat. It doesn't mean you accept abusive behavior or allow people to treat you poorly without any boundaries. What it means is that you respond from a place of spiritual strength rather than emotional weakness. There's a huge difference between someone having a bad attitude and someone being used as a vessel for spiritual opposition. There's a difference between normal human conflict and coordinated spiritual attacks designed to derail your purpose and steal your peace. Learning to discern the difference is one of the most important skills you can develop as a believer. And here's how you do it. You pay attention to patterns. You notice timing. You observe the fruit that conversations produce in your life and relationships. When someone is just having a difficult day or struggling with personal issues, their words might be harsh, but they don't carry a spiritual weight that leaves you feeling drained or confused about God's direction in your life. When someone is being influenced by demonic spirits, their words are specifically designed to target your faith, your calling, your relationship with God, and your confidence in His plans for your future. The enemy is strategic. He doesn't waste time on random attacks. He studies your weaknesses, your insecurities, and your areas of spiritual vulnerability. Then he uses people who have access to your heart to deliver precisely crafted words that will hit those vulnerable places and create maximum spiritual damage. This is why you can have 100 conversations with someone, and 99 of them are perfectly normal. But that one conversation, where they suddenly start speaking words that contradict everything God has shown you about your life and future, that's not a coincidence. That's warfare. And when you recognize it as warfare, you can respond with the appropriate weapons. You don't fight flesh and blood with flesh and blood strategies. You fight spiritual forces with spiritual authority. Here's what this looks like practically. When someone starts speaking words over your life that contradict what God has spoken, you don't argue about their opinion. You recognize that you're not dealing with their opinion at all. You're dealing with a spiritual force that wants to use their voice to plant doubt in your heart. In that moment, you have a choice. You can engage the person and try to convince them they're wrong, which gives power to the words they're speaking and draws you into an argument you can't win. Or you can address the spiritual source behind their words and refuse to give those words any place in your heart or mind. Jesus demonstrated this perfectly when Peter tried to discourage him from fulfilling his purpose. He didn't say, "Peter, I disagree with your perspective." He said, "Get behind me, Satan." He recognized that Peter wasn't speaking from his own heart in that moment. He was being influenced by a spirit that was opposed to God's will. And Jesus addressed that spirit directly while maintaining his love and relationship with Peter. This is the model we need to follow. We separate the person from the influence. We refuse to take personally what was never personal to begin with. And we use our spiritual authority to silence the voices that are trying to speak through people we care about, to accomplish purposes they would never consciously agree to. But here's what most believers miss. Your spiritual authority isn't just reactive. It's not just about responding to attacks when they come. Your greatest power lies in creating an atmosphere where those attacks become ineffective before they even begin. When you walk in consistent fellowship with God, when your life is saturated with His presence and His word, when you're operating from a place of spiritual fullness rather than spiritual emptiness, you become a walking sanctuary. People either encounter the peace of God when they're around you, or the spiritual forces influencing them become uncomfortable and start to manifest. This is why some believers seem to attract conflict wherever they go, while others seem to carry a peace that transforms every environment they enter. It's not about personality or natural gifting. It's about spiritual atmosphere. The enemy can only operate effectively in environments where he's welcome. When your life becomes a place where God's presence is enthroned, where His word is honored, where worship and prayer are priorities, demonic influences lose their power to hide and manipulate. They either flee from that atmosphere, or they're forced to show themselves clearly, which makes them much easier to address directly. This is why your personal spiritual discipline matters so much more than most people realize. It's not just about you having a good quiet time or feeling close to God. Your prayer life, your time in the Word, your worship, your fasting, these aren't just personal spiritual activities. They're weapons of warfare that create a spiritual climate around you that makes it nearly impossible for demonic forces to operate effectively through the people in your sphere of influence. Think about it this way. When you walk into a room filled with smoke, you don't have to try to smell it. The smoke announces itself immediately. But when you walk into a room filled with fresh air and light, that atmosphere is just as obvious, just in the opposite direction. Your spiritual condition works the same way. You're either carrying an atmosphere of heaven, or you're vulnerable to the atmosphere of hell. And here's something that will revolutionize how you think about difficult people in your life. When you're consistently walking in spiritual fullness, when your heart is clean before God and your mind is renewed by His word, you become like a spiritual detector. The people who are being influenced by dark forces will start reacting to your presence in ways that reveal what's really operating through them. You've probably experienced this without realizing what was happening. You walk into a conversation feeling peaceful and centered, and suddenly someone becomes agitated or hostile for no apparent reason. They start saying things that seem designed to provoke you or draw you into an argument. Their whole demeanor changes when you're around, even though you haven't said or done anything offensive. What's happening in those moments is that the spiritual atmosphere you carry is creating pressure on the demonic influences that are operating through that person. They become uncomfortable. They start to manifest, and they try to use that person's voice and actions to either drive you away or provoke you into responding in your flesh instead of your spirit. Most believers miss this completely because they take it personally. They think the person doesn't like them or has a problem with them specifically. But what's really happening is that light and darkness cannot coexist peacefully. When you show up carrying the presence of God, the spiritual forces that thrive in darkness have to either flee or fight. This is actually a good thing, even though it doesn't feel good in the moment. When demonic influences are forced to show themselves clearly, they lose their power to work in hidden, subtle ways. They can no longer whisper lies and plant doubts without being detected. They're exposed, and once they're exposed, they can be addressed directly with spiritual authority. But here's where most Christians make a critical mistake. When they start recognizing spiritual warfare in their relationships, they assume their job is to cast demons out of people or to engage in dramatic confrontations. They think they need to start calling out spirits by name or performing deliverance ministry on their family members and co-workers. Let me save you a lot of unnecessary conflict and ineffective spiritual activity. Your primary calling is not to deliver other people from demonic influence. Your primary calling is to walk in such spiritual authority and atmospheric presence that those influences cannot operate effectively in your environment. Jesus didn't go around looking for people to deliver from demons, but wherever he went, demons couldn't stay hidden. They were forced to manifest because his presence created an atmosphere where they couldn't operate in secret. And when they did manifest, he dealt with them quickly and authoritatively, but always with love and compassion for the person who was being oppressed. This is the model we need to follow. We don't go looking for spiritual battles, but we walk in such a way that when spiritual opposition does arise, we're prepared to handle it effectively. We create environments where God's voice is louder than the enemy's whispers. We carry ourselves with the kind of spiritual confidence that makes demonic forces think twice before trying to use people around us to accomplish their purposes. Now, let me get practical about what this looks like in your daily life. Because understanding spiritual principles is one thing, but knowing how to apply them in real situations is where most believers struggle. Let's say you have a family member who has been speaking discouragement over your life for months. Every conversation somehow turns into them questioning your decisions, criticizing your faith, or planting doubt about God's direction for your future. You've tried reasoning with them. You've tried avoiding the topics that trigger these conversations. But nothing seems to change, and you're starting to feel spiritually drained every time you're around them. Here's what you need to understand. If this pattern has been consistent, if the timing of these conversations seems designed to hit you when you're already vulnerable, and if the content of what they're saying specifically targets your relationship with God or your confidence in His plans for your life, you're not dealing with someone who simply has a different opinion. You're dealing with someone who is being influenced by spirits that have a specific assignment against your spiritual progress. The first thing you need to do is stop trying to change their mind through natural conversation. Every time you engage their arguments with logical responses, you're giving power to the words they're speaking and drawing yourself into a battle you cannot win with human reasoning. Instead, you need to start interceding for that person in private. You need to recognize that they are under attack just as much as you are, and they probably don't even realize what's happening. The enemy is using their voice to attack you, but he's also using their relationship with you to damage their own heart and create division in your family. When you pray for someone who is being used to attack you spiritually, something powerful happens. You begin to see them the way God sees them. Your heart softens toward them even while you maintain firm boundaries about what you will and will not accept from them. And you begin to operate from a place of spiritual authority rather than emotional reaction. But prayer alone isn't enough. You also need to change how you respond when they start speaking those discouraging words. Instead of defending yourself or trying to prove them wrong, you need to refuse to give their words any place in your heart or mind. This doesn't mean you become rude or disrespectful. It means you recognize that what they're saying isn't coming from their heart, so you don't receive it into yours. You might say something like, "I hear what you're saying, but I'm not going to agree with words that contradict what God has shown me about my life." You're not arguing with them. You're not trying to convince them they're wrong. You're simply refusing to allow their words to plant seeds of doubt or discouragement in your spirit. You're drawing a line in the sand and saying, "This is where your influence stops and my faith begins." When you respond this way consistently, something interesting happens. The spiritual forces that have been using that person to attack you begin to realize that their strategy isn't working. They're not getting the emotional reaction they were hoping for. They're not successfully planting doubt or stealing your peace. And often, they'll either stop using that person to attack you, or they'll escalate their tactics, which forces them to show themselves more clearly. If they escalate, if the person's behavior becomes more obviously irrational or hostile, that's actually progress. It means the hidden influence is being forced into the open where it can be addressed directly. But it also means you need to be even more strategic about how you handle the situation. This is where wisdom becomes crucial. Not every spiritual battle needs to be fought with direct confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is create distance while continuing to pray and intercede. Sometimes love looks like protecting yourself from someone who is consistently being used to attack your spiritual well-being. Jesus himself demonstrated this principle. When he was in his hometown and the people there couldn't receive what he had to offer because of their unbelief, he didn't stay there trying to convince them. He moved on to places where hearts were open and faith was present. There's a difference between giving up on someone and recognizing that your assignment with them might be different than you thought. You can love someone, pray for them, and believe God for their breakthrough while still maintaining boundaries that protect your own spiritual health and peace. But before you consider walking away from any relationship, there are several other strategies you need to try. Because sometimes the breakthrough you're praying for is just one conversation away, and that conversation might be the one where you finally address the spiritual forces at work instead of just dealing with surface-level symptoms. The key is learning to speak with spiritual authority rather than emotional intensity. There's a huge difference between the two, and most believers never learn to make this distinction. Emotional intensity is loud, reactive, and focused on being heard. Spiritual authority is often quiet, but it carries the weight of heaven behind it. When Jesus encountered demonic forces, he didn't raise his voice or get emotionally worked up. He spoke with calm confidence, and the spiritual realm had no choice but to respond. His authority wasn't based on volume or passion. It was based on his alignment with the Father and his understanding of the power that had been given to him. This is the kind of authority you need to develop. Not the authority that comes from your personality or your ability to argue, but the authority that comes from knowing who you are in Christ and understanding the power that operates through you when you're walking in obedience to God's word. Here's what this looks like practically. Instead of saying, "You're being influenced by demons," which will immediately put the person on the defensive and probably make them think you've lost your mind, you learn to address the spiritual atmosphere without directly confronting the person. You might say something like, "I sense there's some confusion in this conversation, and I want to speak peace over both of us right now." Or, "I feel like we're both being influenced by something that doesn't want us to have unity, so I'm going to pray for clarity and love to fill this space." You're not accusing the person of being demonized. You're not making them feel attacked or defensive, but you are addressing the spiritual forces at work. and you're inviting God's presence into the situation in a way that makes it impossible for those forces to continue operating effectively. Most of the time, when you do this with genuine love and spiritual authority, you'll see an immediate shift in the person's demeanor. They'll become calmer. Their words will become less hostile or manipulative. The spiritual pressure in the room will lift, and you'll be able to have a productive conversation. But sometimes the spiritual influences will fight back harder. The person might become more agitated or say things that are even more out of character. If this happens, don't panic. It means your spiritual authority is working, and the enemy is trying to escalate the situation to get you to respond in your flesh, instead of maintaining your position of spiritual strength. This is where your preparation matters most. If you haven't been spending time in prayer and in the Word, if you haven't been building your relationship with God and developing your spiritual discernment, you won't have the strength or wisdom to handle these kinds of escalated spiritual confrontations. But when you have been faithful in the secret place, when your heart is clean before God and your mind is renewed by His truth, you can stand in the middle of spiritual opposition and speak with the kind of authority that silences every voice that contradicts God's purposes for your life. The goal is never to embarrass someone or make them feel foolish. The goal is to create space for God's voice to be heard above the noise of spiritual confusion and opposition. When you succeed in doing this, everyone wins. The person who is being influenced gets freedom, you get peace, and the enemy's strategy gets completely disrupted. But it all starts with recognizing that you're not fighting people. You're fighting for people. And the weapons you use in this fight are not natural weapons. They're spiritual weapons that are mighty through God for the pulling down of strongholds and the setting free of captives. Understanding this distinction changes everything about how you approach difficult relationships and challenging conversations. Instead of feeling like a victim of other people's attitudes and behaviors, you begin to see yourself as an agent of God's kingdom, strategically positioned to bring His light into situations where darkness has been operating. You stop taking things personally because you realize that most of the time, what feels personal isn't personal at all. It's spiritual. And when you address it spiritually, with wisdom, love, and authority, you often discover that the person you thought was your enemy was actually just as much a victim of spiritual attack as you were. This is where we need to get into the practical mechanics of what spiritual authority actually looks like when you're dealing with people who are being influenced by demonic forces. Because understanding the concept is one thing, but knowing how to walk it out in real-time conversations is where most believers stumble. Let me give you a framework that will completely transform how you handle these situations. It's what I call the 3-step protocol for silencing demonic influence through people, and it's based directly on the pattern Jesus used throughout His earthly ministry. Step 1 is recognition. Step 2 is intercession. Step 3 is declaration. And here's what's critical to understand. You must follow this sequence. Most Christians want to jump straight to step 3, the declaration part, because it feels more powerful and dramatic. But when you skip the first 2 steps, your declarations carry no weight in the spiritual realm. Let's start with recognition. This is where you develop the spiritual discernment to distinguish between someone having a bad day and someone being used as a mouthpiece for demonic opposition. The difference isn't always obvious on the surface, but there are specific markers you can learn to identify. First, pay attention to timing. Demonic attacks through people almost always happen at strategic moments, right before you're about to make an important decision for God's kingdom, right after you've experienced a spiritual breakthrough or received clarity about your calling, right when you're preparing to step into something new that will advance God's purposes in your life. If someone who normally supports you suddenly starts speaking discouragement or doubt over your life at one of these crucial moments, that's not a coincidence. That's warfare. The enemy knows that timing is everything, and he uses people who have access to your heart to deliver his attacks when they'll cause maximum damage. Second, listen to the content of what's being said. Words that come from human frustration or concern will focus on practical issues: money, timing, resources, logistics. But words that come from demonic influence will specifically target your identity in Christ, your calling, your relationship with God, or your confidence in His promises over your life. The enemy doesn't waste time on surface-level discouragement. He goes straight for the foundations of your faith. He uses people to speak words that are designed to make you question whether God really called you, whether you really heard His voice, whether you're really qualified for what He's asked you to do. Third, observe the fruit that conversations produce in your spirit. Normal human conflict, even when it's intense, doesn't leave you feeling spiritually drained or confused about God's direction for your life. It might make you frustrated or disappointed, but it doesn't shake your fundamental confidence in what God has spoken to you. But when someone is being used by demonic forces to attack you, their words carry a spiritual weight that goes beyond natural disagreement. You walk away from those conversations feeling like something has been stolen from you. Your peace is gone. Your clarity is clouded. Your excitement about God's plans for your future has been replaced with doubt and confusion. When you recognize these three markers, strategic timing, targeted content, and fruit that steals rather than builds, you know you're dealing with more than human opinion. You're dealing with calculated spiritual opposition that requires a spiritual response. This brings us to step 2, intercession. This is the step most believers skip, and it's the reason their attempts at spiritual warfare are often ineffective or even counterproductive. Before you address the spiritual forces operating through someone else, you need to address your own spiritual position. Here's what intercession looks like practically. You remove yourself from the situation if possible, even if it's just for a few minutes. You go somewhere private where you can pray without interruption, and you begin by examining your own heart before God. Are you operating from a place of offense or love? Are you trying to prove you're right or genuinely seeking God's heart for this person? Are you spiritually prepared for the level of warfare you're about to engage, or are you responding out of frustration and emotion? This is crucial because spiritual authority only operates through clean vessels. If your heart is polluted with unforgiveness, pride, or selfish ambition, your attempts to silence demonic influence will actually give the enemy more ground to work with. He'll use your own spiritual weaknesses against you and turn what could have been a victory into a defeat. Once you've examined your own heart and made sure you're operating from a place of spiritual purity, you begin interceding for the person who's being influenced. You pray for their protection. You ask God to open their eyes to see what's happening to them. You bind the spiritual forces that are using them and loose the spirit of truth and clarity over their mind. This is where many believers get confused about spiritual warfare. They think their job is to cast demons out of people or to engage in dramatic confrontations with evil spirits. But most demonic influence doesn't require deliverance ministry. It requires intercession and spiritual authority. The vast majority of people who are being used by demonic forces are not possessed. They're being influenced. There's a huge difference. Possessed people need professional deliverance ministry from trained, mature believers. But influenced people need someone who will stand in the gap for them in prayer and then speak with spiritual authority to silence the voices that are trying to operate through them. During your time of intercession, you also prepare your own spirit for what you're about to do. You remind yourself that you're not fighting against flesh and blood. You declare your identity in Christ and the authority that operates through you because of His finished work on the cross. You put on the full armor of God, not as a religious ritual, but as a spiritual reality that protects you during spiritual battle. And here's something most believers miss completely. You ask God for strategy. You don't just assume you know how to handle the situation. You ask the Holy Spirit to show you exactly what to say, when to say it, and how to say it in a way that will be most effective for that specific person and situation. Sometimes He'll tell you to speak directly to the spiritual forces. Sometimes He'll tell you to simply speak truth and life over the person without mentioning spiritual warfare at all. Sometimes he'll tell you to remain silent and let your presence and prayers do the work. The key is being sensitive to his leading rather than following a formula. Once you've completed the intercession phase, you're ready for step 3, declaration. This is where you speak with spiritual authority to silence the demonic voices that are trying to operate through the person you're dealing with. But here's what's critical to understand. Declaration doesn't mean you walk up to someone and say, "I rebuke the demon of criticism that's operating through you." That's not spiritual authority. That's spiritual immaturity, and it will almost always make the situation worse. True spiritual authority often sounds completely natural to outside observers. It's not about using special religious language or making dramatic proclamations. It's about speaking truth with the weight of heaven behind it in a way that the spiritual realm recognizes and responds to. Let me give you some practical examples of what this looks like. Let's say your spouse comes home and starts attacking your character, questioning your spiritual maturity, and speaking words that are clearly designed to tear down your confidence in God's calling on your life. After you've gone through the recognition and intercession phases, you might respond by saying something like, "I hear the frustration in your voice, and I want to understand what's really going on here, but I'm not going to receive words that contradict what God has spoken over my life." Let's pause for a moment and ask him to give us both clarity about what's happening in this conversation. Notice what you're doing here. You're acknowledging the person's emotions without accepting their words. You're drawing a clear boundary about what you will and will not allow to influence your spirit. And you're inviting God's presence into the situation in a way that makes it impossible for demonic forces to continue operating effectively. Most of the time, when you respond like this with genuine love and spiritual authority, you'll see an immediate shift. The person's demeanor will soften. Their words will become less hostile. The spiritual atmosphere in the room will change, and you'll be able to have a productive conversation. But sometimes, the spiritual forces will escalate. The person might become more agitated or say things that are even more irrational and hurtful. If this happens, don't take it personally and don't back down from your position of spiritual authority. This escalation actually means your authority is working. The demonic influences that were operating in a hidden, subtle way are now being forced into the open, where they can be addressed directly. But this is also where wisdom becomes crucial. If someone's behavior becomes abusive or completely irrational, you don't stay in that situation trying to cast demons out of them. You remove yourself from their presence while continuing to intercede for them. You protect your own spiritual and emotional well-being while maintaining your heart of love and prayer for their freedom. Remember, your primary responsibility is not to deliver other people from demonic influence. Your primary responsibility is to walk in such spiritual authority that those influences cannot operate effectively in your environment. Now let me address something that confuses many believers. How do you handle situations where the person being influenced is someone you can't easily remove yourself from? What if it's your spouse, your parent, your child, or your boss? This is where the long-term strategy becomes more important than the immediate tactical response. You begin creating an atmosphere in your home, your relationships, and your personal life that makes it increasingly difficult for demonic forces to find a foothold. You start speaking life and truth over that person consistently, not just when they're attacking you. You begin praying for them daily, binding the spiritual forces that are trying to influence them, and loosing the Spirit of God over their mind and heart. You create an environment of worship, prayer, and biblical truth that saturates the spiritual atmosphere around them. And here's what often happens. As you consistently walk in spiritual authority and create this kind of atmosphere, the person either begins to change dramatically, or the spiritual forces that were using them start looking for easier targets. Demons are opportunistic. They prefer to work through people who give them the least resistance and create the most chaos with the least effort. When someone is constantly surrounded by prayer, truth, and spiritual authority, they become a much less attractive vessel for demonic influence. But let me be clear about something. This process takes time, and it requires incredible spiritual discipline on your part. You can't pray for someone for a week and expect 20 years of spiritual bondage to be broken. You can't speak life over someone occasionally and expect to see immediate transformation in their behavior. This is spiritual warfare, not spiritual microwave cooking. But when you're consistent, when you're faithful, when you're walking in genuine spiritual authority rather than religious performance, the results can be absolutely miraculous. I've seen marriages completely transformed when one spouse learned to stop fighting their partner and started fighting for them. I've seen parents who were being used to speak discouragement over their children's lives become their greatest source of spiritual encouragement. I've seen workplace relationships that were filled with conflict and manipulation become environments of mutual respect and productivity. But it all started with someone who understood spiritual authority and was willing to apply it consistently over time. Someone who recognized that they weren't fighting people, they were fighting for people. Here's something else you need to understand about operating in spiritual authority. The enemy will test your resolve. Once you start walking in this level of spiritual warfare, he'll often escalate his attacks to see if you're serious about maintaining your position. He might use multiple people to speak the same discouraging words over your life. He might intensify the timing of attacks, hitting you when you're already dealing with stress or physical exhaustion. He might even use people you respect and trust to deliver his lies in ways that are harder to recognize and resist. This is not a sign that your spiritual authority isn't working. It's actually a sign that it is working, and the enemy is getting desperate. But it's also a test of your spiritual maturity and consistency. Many believers start operating in spiritual authority and see some initial results, but then they get discouraged when the attacks intensify instead of disappearing completely. They assume they must be doing something wrong, so they go back to their old patterns of taking things personally and trying to fight people instead of fighting spiritual forces. Don't make this mistake. Understand that breakthrough often comes right after the biggest test of your faith and resolve. The enemy's most intense attacks usually happen right before his complete defeat in that area of your life. This is why your spiritual foundation is so crucial. If you're not spending consistent time in prayer, in the Word, and in worship, you won't have the spiritual strength to maintain your authority when the pressure increases. You'll default back to fighting in your flesh instead of standing firm in your spirit. But when you are spiritually prepared, when your relationship with God is your highest priority, you can stand in the middle of intense spiritual opposition and speak with the kind of authority that not only silences demonic voices, but actually sets people free from influences they didn't even realize were controlling them. And here's the beautiful thing about walking in this level of spiritual authority. It doesn't just protect you from attack, it positions you to be an agent of freedom in other people's lives. When you consistently respond to spiritual opposition with spiritual authority, you become someone that God can use to break strongholds and set captives free. People will start coming to you because they sense something different about you. They'll say things like, "I don't know what it is, but when I'm around you, I feel peaceful." Or, "When you pray for me, something changes." What they're recognizing is the presence and authority of God operating through your life. This is your inheritance as a believer. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Greater works than these shall you do." Not greater miracles necessarily, but greater impact in the spiritual realm, greater authority over the forces of darkness, greater effectiveness in setting people free from the lies and influences that have been controlling their lives. But it all starts with understanding that you're not fighting people, you're fighting for people. And the weapons you use in this fight are not natural weapons, they're spiritual weapons that are mighty through God for the pulling down of strongholds. The question is not whether you have this authority, If you belong to Jesus Christ, you absolutely do. The question is whether you'll learn to walk in it consistently, wisely, and effectively. In the next part of this series, we're going to dive even deeper into the practical strategies for creating an atmosphere where demonic voices cannot operate. We're going to talk about the power of worship, the authority of God's word, and the strategic use of fasting and prayer to create breakthrough in the most stubborn situations. But for now, I want you to start practicing what we've covered today. Begin paying attention to the patterns in your difficult relationships. Start recognizing the difference between human frustration and spiritual opposition. Begin interceding for the people who have been used to attack you spiritually instead of just being frustrated with them. And most importantly, start speaking with the authority that God has already given you. Not with arrogance or harshness, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are in Christ and understanding the power that operates through you when you're aligned with His will. Remember, you are not powerless. You are not a victim of other people's attitudes and behaviors. You are a child of the Most High God, equipped with spiritual authority that can silence every voice that contradicts His purposes for your life. The battle is real, but the victory is already yours. You just need to learn how to walk in the authority that heaven has already provided. The transformation begins when you stop reacting and start responding. There's a profound difference between these two approaches, and understanding this difference will revolutionize how you handle every spiritual attack that comes through the people in your life. When you react, you're operating from your emotions. You're letting someone else's words or behavior determine your spiritual posture. You're giving them the power to pull you out of your authority and into their chaos. But when you respond, you're operating from your spirit. You're maintaining your connection to heaven while addressing what's happening on earth. Let me show you what this looks like in real time. Imagine you're at a family gathering and everything is going well until that one relative starts their familiar pattern. They begin questioning your life decisions, criticizing your faith, making sarcastic comments about your relationship with God. The words are hitting all your sensitive spots, and you can feel your flesh rising up to defend itself. This is the moment that determines whether you win or lose the spiritual battle. Your flesh wants to argue. Your emotions want to prove them wrong. Your pride wants to put them in their place. But your spirit knows something different. Your spirit recognizes that this isn't really about you at all. Instead of taking the bait, you pause. You take a breath. You remind yourself that you're not wrestling against flesh and blood. And then you do something that completely disrupts the enemy's strategy. You respond with spiritual authority instead of emotional reactivity. You might say something like, "I can see this conversation is getting tense, and I don't want either of us to say things we'll regret. Why don't we talk about something else?" Notice what you're doing. You're not defending yourself. You're not arguing your point. You're simply refusing to participate in the spiritual attack while maintaining love and respect for the person. Or maybe you say, "I hear your concerns, but I'm confident in the direction God has given me. I appreciate that you care enough to share your thoughts." Again, you're acknowledging their words without receiving them into your spirit. You're drawing a boundary while keeping your heart soft. The key is that you're responding from a place of spiritual strength rather than emotional weakness. You're not letting their attack determine your spiritual posture. You're maintaining your position of authority while refusing to give the enemy what he's looking for, which is an emotional reaction that pulls you into the flesh. Here's what happens when you consistently respond this way. The spiritual forces that have been using that person to attack you begin to realize their strategy isn't working. They're not getting the reaction they were hoping for. They're not successfully stealing your peace or planting doubt in your heart. And often, they'll either stop using that person to attack you, or they'll escalate their tactics in ways that make their influence more obvious. Both outcomes are actually victories. If they stop, you've successfully silenced their voice through that person. If they escalate, they're forced to show themselves more clearly, which makes them easier to address with direct spiritual authority. But let me address something that many believers struggle with. What do you do when the person being used to attack you is someone you're in covenant relationship with? Your spouse, your parent, your child. These are people you can't just walk away from, people you're called to love and serve regardless of how they're behaving. This is where the long-term strategy becomes crucial. With covenant relationships, your goal isn't just to silence the immediate attack. Your goal is to create such a strong atmosphere of spiritual authority in your relationship that demonic influences can no longer find a foothold there at all. This requires a completely different approach. Instead of just responding to attacks when they come, you begin proactively saturating that relationship with prayer, truth, and the presence of God. You start speaking life over that person daily, not just when they're attacking you. You begin interceding for them regularly, binding the spiritual forces that try to influence them and loosing the Spirit of God over their mind and heart. You also start examining your own contribution to the spiritual atmosphere in that relationship. Are you walking in unforgiveness? Are you harboring bitterness or resentment? Are you trying to control or manipulate the situation instead of trusting God to bring change in His timing? These questions matter because demonic forces look for open doors, and unforgiveness is one of their favorite entry points. If you're holding offense against someone while trying to operate in spiritual authority over the forces influencing them, you're actually giving those forces more ground to work with. True spiritual authority requires a clean heart. It requires you to forgive, not because the person deserves it, but because unforgiveness gives the enemy legal access to your life and relationships. When you walk in genuine forgiveness, when your heart is pure before God, your spiritual authority carries a weight that demonic forces cannot resist. Let me give you a practical example of how this works. Let's say your spouse has been consistently critical and discouraging for months. Every conversation seems to turn into them questioning your decisions, attacking your character, or speaking doubt over your future. You've tried talking to them about it, but nothing seems to change. Here's what most believers do in this situation. They either shut down emotionally and stop communicating, or they fight back with their own critical words. Both responses actually give more power to the spiritual forces that are influencing their spouse. But here's what walking in spiritual authority looks like in this situation. First, you examine your own heart. Have you been contributing to the negative atmosphere through your own words or attitudes? Have you been responding in your flesh instead of your spirit? Have you been harboring unforgiveness or resentment? If you find areas where you need to repent, you do so immediately. You get your own heart clean before God so that your spiritual authority can operate without hindrance. Then you begin a strategic campaign of spiritual warfare on behalf of your spouse. Every morning, before you even get out of bed, you pray for them. You bind the spiritual forces that try to influence their thoughts and emotions throughout the day. You loose the spirit of peace, love, and clarity over their mind. You declare God's truth over their identity and their relationship with you. Throughout the day, you look for opportunities to speak life over them. Not fake positivity or manipulation, but genuine words of affirmation and blessing. You remind them of who they are in God's eyes. You speak about your future together with faith and hope instead of fear and doubt. When they do start speaking critically or negatively, you don't take it personally. You recognize that they're under attack just as much as you are. You respond with gentleness and truth instead of defensiveness and argument. And here's what often happens when you maintain this approach consistently over time. The spiritual atmosphere in your relationship begins to shift. The attacks become less frequent and less intense. Your spouse starts responding to you differently, even though you haven't tried to change their behavior directly. Why does this work? Because you're creating an environment where God's presence is stronger than the enemy's influence. You're saturating that relationship with so much prayer, truth, and love that demonic forces can no longer operate effectively there. But let me be honest with you. This approach requires incredible spiritual discipline and maturity. It's much easier to fight back when someone attacks you than it is to consistently respond with love and spiritual authority. It's more natural to take things personally than it is to recognize the spiritual forces behind someone's behavior. This is why your personal relationship with God is so crucial. If you're not spending time in His presence daily, if you're not being filled with His love and peace regularly, you won't have the spiritual resources to maintain this kind of response when you're under attack. Your quiet time isn't just about feeling close to God. It's about being equipped for spiritual warfare. Your time in worship isn't just about enjoying God's presence. It's about creating an atmosphere where His voice becomes louder than the enemy's whispers. Your time in the Word isn't just about gaining knowledge. It's about renewing your mind so that you can recognize truth from lies, even in the heat of spiritual battle. When you're consistently full of God's presence, when your mind is saturated with His truth, when your heart is anchored in His love, you become virtually immune to the enemy's attacks through other people. Not because the attacks stop coming, but because they lose their power to move you out of your spiritual authority. You begin to carry such a strong atmosphere of heaven that people either encounter God's peace when they're around you, or the spiritual forces influencing them become uncomfortable and start to manifest more clearly. Let me tell you about something I call the displacement principle. This is one of the most powerful concepts you can understand when it comes to silencing demonic voices through people. The principle is simple. Light displaces darkness automatically. You don't have to fight darkness. You just have to turn on the light, and darkness has no choice but to flee. In the spiritual realm, this means that when you walk in genuine spiritual authority, when you're consistently filled with God's presence and operating from His truth, you don't have to fight demonic influences directly. Your very presence begins to displace them. Think about what happens when you walk into a completely dark room and flip on the light switch. The darkness doesn't argue with the light. It doesn't resist or put up a fight. It simply disappears because light and darkness cannot coexist in the same space. The same thing happens in the spiritual realm when you learn to walk as a carrier of God's light. Demonic influences that have been operating in hidden, subtle ways are forced to either flee or manifest more clearly, where they can be addressed directly. This is why some believers seem to attract conflict wherever they go, while others seem to carry a peace that transforms every environment they enter. It's not about personality or natural gifting. It's about spiritual atmosphere. The believers who attract conflict are often operating in their flesh. They're trying to fight spiritual battles with natural weapons. They're taking things personally and responding emotionally. And their flesh-based responses actually give demonic forces more energy and opportunity to work. But the believers who transform atmospheres are operating from their spirit. They're walking in genuine spiritual authority. They're responding to spiritual attacks with spiritual weapons. And their consistent, mature responses create an environment where God's presence is stronger than the enemy's influence. Here's how you begin to operate in this displacement principle. You stop trying to fight every demonic influence you encounter directly. Instead, you focus on increasing the presence of God in your life and in your environment. You saturate your home with worship music. You fill your conversations with words of life and truth. You cover your family in prayer daily. You speak blessings over your workplace. You create an atmosphere so saturated with God's presence that demonic influences become uncomfortable and start looking for easier targets. This doesn't mean you become passive or ignore spiritual attacks when they come. It means you respond from a position of spiritual fullness rather than spiritual emptiness. It means you address spiritual opposition from a place of strength rather than weakness. When someone starts speaking words of discouragement or doubt over your life, You don't panic or get defensive. You recognize that you're hearing the voice of the enemy trying to speak through that person, and you respond with the same authority that Jesus used when he said, "Get behind me, Satan. See." But your authority isn't harsh or condemning toward the person. It's firm and decisive toward the spiritual influence. You separate the person from the spirit influencing them, just like Jesus did with Peter. You might say something like, "I hear what you're saying, but I choose to believe what God has spoken over my life instead." You're not arguing with the person. You're making a declaration about what voice you're going to listen to and follow. Or you might say, "I sense there's some confusion in this conversation. Let me pray for both of us to have clarity and wisdom." You're addressing the spiritual atmosphere without making the person feel attacked or defensive. The key is that you're operating from a place of spiritual authority rather than emotional reactivity. You're maintaining your connection to heaven while dealing with what's happening on earth. Now let me address something that many believers find challenging. How do you maintain this level of spiritual authority when you're dealing with multiple attacks from different people at the same time? Sometimes it feels like the enemy is using everyone around you to speak discouragement, doubt, or confusion into your life. Your spouse is critical, your boss is hostile, your friends are negative, and even your family members seem to be working against you. In these situations, it can feel overwhelming to try to address each person individually with spiritual authority. Here's what you need to understand. When you're experiencing coordinated attacks from multiple sources, you're not dealing with separate, unrelated incidents. You're dealing with a strategic campaign from the enemy designed to overwhelm you and get you to respond in your flesh instead of your spirit. The solution isn't to fight each person individually. The solution is to recognize the source behind all the attacks and address it directly through prayer and spiritual warfare. You go into your prayer closet and you have a conversation with the enemy. Not a long dramatic confrontation, but a simple, authoritative declaration. You might say something like, "I recognize what you're trying to do through the people in my life, and I'm not going to allow it. I bind your influence over every relationship I'm involved in, and I loose the spirit of peace, love, and unity in every conversation I have." Then you pray specifically for each person who has been used to attack you. You don't pray against them. You pray for them. You ask God to protect them from the spiritual influences that are trying to use them. You pray for their eyes to be open to what's happening. You pray for your relationships with them to be restored and strengthened. And here's what often happens when you respond this way. The coordinated attacks begin to lose their power. People start responding to you differently without you even talking to them about what was happening. The spiritual atmosphere around you shifts, and the enemy's strategy gets completely disrupted. Why does this work? Because you're addressing the real source of the problem instead of just dealing with symptoms. You're fighting the battle in the spiritual realm where it actually exists, instead of trying to fight it in the natural realm where you don't have the right weapons. But let me give you a warning. When you start operating in this level of spiritual authority consistently, the enemy will test your resolve. He'll often escalate his attacks to see if you're serious about maintaining your position of spiritual strength. You might experience what feels like increased opposition for a season. More people might start attacking you. The attacks might become more intense or personal. You might face challenges in multiple areas of your life at the same time. This is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's actually a sign that you're doing something right, and the enemy is getting desperate. But it's also a test of your spiritual maturity and consistency. Many believers start walking in spiritual authority and see some initial breakthrough, but then they get discouraged when the pressure increases instead of decreasing immediately. They assume they must be missing something, so they go back to their old patterns of taking things personally and trying to fight people instead of fighting spiritual forces. Don't make this mistake. Understand that the greatest breakthrough often comes right after the greatest test. The enemy's most intense attacks usually happen right before his complete defeat in that area of your life. This is why building your spiritual foundation is so important. If you're not consistently spending time with God, if you're not regularly being filled with his presence and truth, you won't have the spiritual strength to maintain your authority when the pressure increases. But when you are spiritually prepared, when your relationship with God is your highest priority, you can stand in the middle of intense spiritual opposition and speak with the kind of authority that not only protects you, but actually sets other people free from the influences that have been controlling them. And here's something beautiful that happens when you learn to walk in this level of spiritual authority consistently. You don't just become immune to the enemy's attacks through other people. You become someone that God can use to break strongholds and set captives free. People will start being drawn to you because they sense something different about your presence. They'll say things like, "I don't know what it is, but when I'm around you, I feel peaceful." Or, "When you speak to me, something inside me settles down." What they're recognizing is the authority of God operating through your life. They're encountering the same presence that caused demons to cry out when Jesus walked into a room. Not because you're trying to be dramatic or super spiritual, but because you're walking in the authority that every believer has been given. This is your inheritance as a child of God. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "You would do greater works than he did." Not necessarily greater miracles, but greater impact in the spiritual realm. Greater authority over the forces of darkness. Greater effectiveness in setting people free from the lies and influences that have been controlling their lives. The question isn't whether you have this authority. If you belong to Jesus Christ, you absolutely do. The question is whether you'll learn to walk in it consistently, wisely, and effectively. In our final section, we're going to talk about the most powerful weapon you have for creating lasting transformation in the people around you. It's not what most believers expect, and it's often the last thing they want to try. But when you understand how to use this weapon properly, it becomes absolutely unstoppable in breaking down the strongest spiritual strongholds and setting the most bound people free. But before we get there, I want you to start implementing what we've covered so far. Begin recognizing the difference between human frustration and spiritual opposition in your relationships. Start responding with spiritual authority instead of emotional reactivity when people attack you. Begin interceding for the people who have been used to speak against you instead of just being frustrated with them. And most importantly, start creating an atmosphere of God's presence in your life that's so strong that demonic influences either flee or are forced to show themselves clearly where they can be addressed directly. Remember, you are not powerless in these situations. You are not a victim of other people's attitudes and behaviors. You have been given authority over every force that tries to work against God's purposes in your life. The battle is real, but the victory is already yours. You just need to learn how to walk in the authority that heaven has already provided. And when you do, you'll discover that silencing demons in people isn't just possible. It's your calling as a believer who understands their identity and authority in Christ.